All right, thanks everybody. So our next keynote speaker asks one of the most important questions for our times. In a time where social media algorithms clamor for our attention, mistrust in institutions is spreading, and misinformation is everywhere, can technology help democracy, or is it only making it more problematic? Kevin Esterling is professor of public policy and chair of political science at UC Riverside, where he directs the Laboratory for Technology, Communication, and Democracy. His research spans more than 15 years of work on deliberative democracy, including a landmark series of experiments in which sitting members of Congress met with constituents in online deliberative town halls, work that became the basis for his book Politics with the People, co-authored with Michael Neblo and David Laser. He chaired the Subcommittee on Technology and Innovation for the American Political Science Association's Presidential Task Force on Congressional Reform. Out of that research came the Prytaneum, an open-source AI-powered platform that gives every voice in a large meeting equal weight. So not just to the loudest voice, not just to the most organized groups, but to everybody. Today, Kevin is going to challenge us with two paradoxes about open source AI and the public sphere, which may reframe how many of us think about the work we do. Please join me in welcoming Kevin.
Since I'm the last speaker today, I wonder if we could just take a second to acknowledge and thank the organizers for today's event. Laura and Stephanie and everybody. I've learned so much today that my head hurts now. But yeah, thank you. And so I'm a political scientist and actually, let me So I'm a political scientist, and in my field, there's been this explosion of mostly open source online deliberation platforms that are designed to make democracy more robust by getting people who use the platforms to become deliberative. And that word deliberation in my field in political science is a term of art. So there's a whole normative theory of deliberative democracy that you need to learn to really know what that word means. But for purposes of today's talk, you could think of deliberation as essentially being the opposite of motivated reasoning or ideology or partisanship, which is when you deliberate, instead of seeking out information to confirm your predispositions, what you do is you seek out diverse perspectives and try to reason across differences in order to solve complex problems. And so for this talk, to try to distinguish that kind of reasoning from motivated reasoning, I'll call the reasoning that people do when they deliberate, I'm going to call it conscientious reasoning, just to give it a term. And it turns out that whether you are a motivated reasoner or a conscientious reasoner is just situational. And that's true for every one of us. There's times where you're a motivated reasoner, other times when you're a conscientious reasoner. And so what these platforms try to do is they try to induce people to engage in conscientious reasoning. And I'm going to give some examples of that in just a minute. But these are online platforms. And so, of course, they use AI because everything uses AI. The next refrigerator or toaster oven you buy will have AI in it. So everything has AI, including these platforms that are designed to make democracy more robust. And as you guys know, and in fact, it was mentioned at an earlier panel today, there's really just a tiny ecosystem of truly open source LLMs that power AI. And the person who mentioned this mentioned these two models, Olmo and Bloom. There might be others, but there's really not that many of them. But they do exist. And I think, again, like everybody in this room is going to agree that open source development is much more aligned with democratic principles than private development, right? So open source development is collaborative, it's transparent, it's ethical, it's community driven, typically not profit, right? It's open, right? So it's really, open source development is really aligned with kind of the principles of, with democratic principles. And so you would think that the developers of these online platforms would be attracted to using open source AI in their pipelines. But what's interesting is that all of the big ones, and so I haven't done a census of all of them, but the ones that in my field that people talk about all the time, all make use of black box models or closed models. And you know, maybe that's not a huge surprise because it's harder to use the open source ones. But I really think that a lot of them are just like, dude, you know, we use Claude, right? And it's just exciting. But I think, you know, but as everyone in this room knows, right, black box models are like anti-democratic. They're you know, not transparent. They're not ethical in how they use data. They're not trustworthy, right? So I think there is a disconnect for whatever reason, right? When these platforms that are designed to make democracy more robust are making use of this kind of anti-democratic technology. And so what I'm going to try to do today is to try to understand that disconnect by kind of trying to explore these two paradoxes. So just again, I think everybody in this room will agree, right? We can just stipulate, right, that open source models are more aligned with democratic principles than closed source models, right? And so there's kind of this disconnect. But I'm going to try to understand that through these two paradoxes, and each one applies to a different kind of platform. So the first paradox is going to apply to platforms that make use of AI in their pipeline to try to, you know, accelerate human reasoning or to improve it or even just to induce it, right? So where on these platforms, it's the humans that are doing the reasoning and the LLM kind of scaffolds that and makes it better. And what I'm going to argue is that for those kinds of platforms, the AI is enhancing deliberation, and it turns out closed box models do just fine for that. And then in the second paragraph the second paradox is going to apply to the kinds of platforms where the LLM is actually providing reasoning, right? Where you could think of the LLM as itself a debate participant, either with other LLMs or with people. And so you could think on these platforms, the LLM is kind of replacing human reasoning. And what I'm going to argue is that LLMs inherently undermine deliberation when they engage as a kind of a debate participant in the platforms, and that even if the model was open source and fully ethical, it's not going to correct that. And so essentially, what I'm going to argue that kind of explains the disconnect is that for either way, either type of platform, it turns out whether just for practical reasons, whether the model is open or closed isn't going to matter. So by the way, this is my first time giving this talk. I wrote this talk for you guys for today. And so a lot of this is all ideas that I'm just sort of thinking through for the first time. Okay, so starting with the first paradox, which is relevant again to platforms where the AI is intended to make humans better reasoners, right? Either get them to reason in this conscientious way or to improve their reasoning. And what I'm going to argue is that closed source models work perfectly well for these platforms because the LLMs they're just intended to improve people's reasoning, right? And then you know, even though they're anti-democratic, you can create an alignment as long as you can validate the LLM output to make sure the output is itself consistent with the normative aspirations of the platform. And again, I'll give examples of this like right now. So I'm going to give 3 examples. The first one is the best known, I think, in my field, which is Polis, which is an open source asynchronous discussion platform. Many of you have probably heard of it. It's actually used by a lot of governments to collect community input on controversial issues. And so the platform actually lets community members submit content that's like policy proposals that are designed to address a problem. and then the comments get routed where participants vote on the proposals that they like. And then what the Polis algorithm does is it uses that voting data to unearth the diverse perspectives in the community, right, to make sure all the different perspectives on the issue are understood. And then it also uses the LLM to try to identify those proposals that span across differences. And so you can see, right, Polis is designed, right, to get people to understand diverse perspectives, to get out of their echo chambers, but also to kind of find ways to solve complex problems. Polis uses Claude, which everybody thinks is cool, but it is a black box model, and this is the pipeline. I won't go into the weeds, but the LLM intervenes in the yellow boxes here, and so the way it works is at the beginning, the public official will use the LLM to kind of seed some ideas to start the discussion on the topic, but then the community members then jump onto the platform, and they're the ones that really provide the content and provide suggestions, right, to address the whatever the issues that's being discussed. And then in the middle yellow boxes, Claude is kind of curating that content. But also, it's involved in the routing where each of these proposals is kind of routed to other members of the community to vote on, and then through that voting, the voting data, Polis can use kind of this scaling method, right, in the polling data to identify clusters of interest in the community on the topic, and so. Right, so then you can kind of identify the different perspectives in the community. And then in that last yellow box, the LLM goes into those clusters and summarizes the perspectives, right, to make it easy for everybody to understand the diverse perspectives in the community. And as I mentioned, Claude also is involved in the process to find policy proposals that span across those clusters and kind of bridge differences. So that's Polis. The second example I'm going to use is the Habermas machine, which is this kind of a small group synchronous discussion platform that it's actually, I don't know if the Habermas machine is available for governments or groups to use, but it's remarked on in the literature that I read as being the gold standard of LLM-powered deliberative platforms. And you can tell it's the gold standard because the paper that describes it was published in Science, right? And so the Habermas machine makes use of Chinchilla, which is an old school, but yet black box Google LLM. And then the pipeline for the Habermas machine is not too different from Polis, right? So there's the organizer poses a question to the group, and then in that first blue box, the members of the group kind of write their opinions to respond to the question. And then the LLM, Chinchilla, intervenes in the purple boxes. And so in that first purple box, the Habermas machine takes in the group members' positions, and it actually drafts a set of candidate consensus statements to try to suggest, some statements that the group might agree to. And then what happens in the middle boxes is the participants then vote on which consensus statements they like the best. And then in the later boxes, it's an iterative process, and they keep doing that until they come up with statements that are of that the group finds to be kind of a good consensus statement for the positions in the group. So again, in this case, the LLM isn't replacing human reasoning, it's sort of summarizing it, but then the humans are the ones that are kind of providing the reasoning and making decisions. Okay, the third example is not famous at all. It's the platform that my lab is developing that the correct pronunciation is Prytaneum, but we say Prytaneum. I don't know why. If you're Greek, you would say Prytaneum. And we make use of Gemini. We actually use Gemini because UCR pays for the API credits. But Printanium is you could think of it as a webinar platform that's designed to enable the speaker to understand and extract insights from the audience in real time during a synchronous meeting, even when the audience scales to a large number of people. And you can kind of see what problem Printanium is designed to solve. If you've ever been on a webinar, right, and especially if you've been a participant on a webinar, you know that webinars, right, the typical webinar platform is an excellent platform for the speaker to communicate to the audience, but they're a terrible platform for the audience to speak back to the speaker, and it's frustrating, right? So webinars intentionally disable audience input while the speaker is speaking, almost entirely, and that's really a problem. So my interest is in normative deliberative democracy, and it's a problem when somebody is speaking but not listening, right? And so what we're trying to do in Printanium is to kind of decenter the speaker, empower the audience, and allow the speaker to understand the perspectives of the audience at the same time the audience is understanding the perspectives of the speaker. So you could think both sides are able to speak and listen at the same time. So we actually don't call it a webinar, we call it a collabinar technology. And that this idea of having the audience, right, be able to speak to the speaker at the same time, we call it many-to-one communication, and it just isn't possible to solve that without AI. So that we really couldn't have built this without using generative AI. And I'm just going to show you a couple of ways that we use it. So one is we make use of AI to tag the audience content when people are submitting questions and comments. The AI tags that content in real time during the meeting, so that by topic, right? So that the organizer can quickly make sense of user content, even if there's kind of a flood of content coming in. And so we use AI in two ways for that tagging. First, we make use of AI to help the organizer kind of brainstorm what the topics will be at an upcoming meeting. So in Printanium, for each meeting, you set up a new event, which has its own settings. And one of the settings is you set your topics by clicking on that blue button, and then it opens up this text box, and you just dump in the reading material that's relevant, right, that informs the topic that you want to discuss at your meeting, and you hit upload. And Gemini, has we use a kind of this topic extraction prompt where Gemini comes back by identifying the topics in your reading material, and it suggests a set of topics that you might want to discuss based on the material. But what's important is that it's a human-in-the-loop process, and so if you don't like some of the suggestions that Gemini came up with, you'd hit the trash can to get rid of it, or you can hit the crayon to edit it and refine the suggestions. You can manually add your own, but then it's this iterative process where you and Gemini can kind of brainstorm together to figure out, well, what's a good set of topics to plan for this event that's coming up. And once you finish curating your topics, then you hit submit, and you get kind of a list of topic tags for your event. And then this is kind of the back end, right? What the facilitator sees, right? The person who's kind of curating the content then can see, right, content is tagged. And so if you want to spend some time talking about stigma, you would filter on stigma and see what everybody said about stigma right before moving on to the next topic. The other way we use AI is like with the other models, we use it to summarize the diverse perspectives in the meeting. And so what's important here is that the AI is able to surface all of the diverse perspectives of people within the meeting. And it's really important because then the people in the meeting not only see, right, their own perspective represented, but then they get to see the perspectives for the viewpoints they disagreed with. And that gets people outside of their echo chamber. Okay, and so none of these models, mine or the other ones, just trust the LLMs kind of off the shelf right? But instead, we always want to audit the LLM output to make sure it's consistent with the normative aspirations of the platform. And so here's an example, right? I just mentioned that this is an example of an audit that we do. And I mentioned that we use a summarization prompt, right, in Gemini. And obviously, you would worry, that Gemini, like all language models, has built-in systemic biases against identity groups, right? And so if the summaries that are, representing the diverse perspectives are systematically excluding certain perspectives, then that would really undermine the deliberativeness of the platform, like really badly, right? And but the thing is, we can check that. And so here what we do is we can look at the cosine similarity between each person's contribution and the summary, right, for the summary that represents their perspective, right? And if it's the case that, right, and so which kind of gives you a sense of the distance that each participant is from their summary of their perspective, right? And so we can check to see if those distances are different across different identity groups. And so you can see in this figure for this, this was a town hall data on, they were discussing whether to expand the US House of Representatives, right? And so the people who supported the policy, right, had their views better represented in the summaries than the opponents do, which just tells you that there's probably more ways to be against something than in favor of something. But conditional on your position, right, we can check to see if there's a bias against different identity groups. And for the most part, there is none. But I picked this one out on purpose because you can see, right, there's this mode here where non-white opponents to the policy, for some reason, like their views were excluded, right, which is what you'd worry about. But that's something we can detect. And we haven't done it, but it would be easy to then just augment our pipeline where we tell Gemini, right, when you detect such a mode, go in there and surface those opinions, right? So it's pretty easy to do that and to check that black box models are complying with the normative expectations of the platform. And so that's kind of the end of the first paragraph, right, is that for the kinds of platforms where LLMs are just designed to augment human reasoning, right, where they're used to kind of surface diverse perspectives and nothing else, right, then or even help to kind of find solutions to complex problems. In the end, this is all just kind of empowering humans to be better deliberators. And again, as long as you validate, right, the closeness of the model, just for practical reasons, doesn't matter. Okay, so for the second paradox, this one is relevant to platforms where the AI is itself a discussion participant, where the AI is providing reasoning. And what I'm going to argue here, right, is that in this situation, the AI is going to undermine deliberation, and like even having an ideal open source development cannot correct it because it has to do with the architecture of large language models themselves. And so here's what I'm going to argue, is that even under ideal open source development, generative AI models risk undermining deliberation because LLMs cannot reason conscientiously, the way I defined it earlier. And so what so obviously we would worry, right, that we worry about LLMs making contributions to public discourse, right, because of the risk of them being weaponized by malicious actors at scale and just flooding the zone. Okay, so that's bad, but that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about are, there's a whole bunch, there's just dozens of these academic projects that are where you have people building platforms or applications where the LLM is a debate participant, right? It's itself a reasoner, right? And so you've probably seen them, but there's a bunch of these, like this one, the co-authors were cut off, but it's Charles Crabtree and then Mitchell Bosley and some others, right? Where they did this, this app where they had an AI that if you're a user on their app, the AI kind of gets on and tries to persuade you to support transgender rights, right? And so you would think that, right, so these are extremely normatively motivated as well, just as much as that first set of platforms that I described, right? And they're all well-intentioned. And on top of that, you would think that LLMs would be well-equipped to do this, right? Because if you prompt an LLM to give a reason for something, like why should the user support transgender rights, the LLM will give you reasons, right? They provide reasons. And indeed, you could use a reasoning model to see what are the reasons for why they gave those reasons, right? So it seems like they're really well designed to be debate partners with humans, but I'm going to argue that they're not, then they cannot be in a normative sense. In order to make this argument, now I need to take a step back and talk a little bit about that normative theory of deliberative democracy that I mentioned on the first slide. And in particular, there's normative requirements of this thing called the public sphere. And so the late philosopher Jürgen Habermas, who passed away a month or so ago, famously defined the public sphere as this discursive space in a free society where people form opinions about public matters through interacting with each other. And what's the essential normative requirement of the public sphere is that the interaction has to be dialogical. It has to be two-way communication, where people are not only speaking, but they're also listening. They have to do both. Because otherwise, if you're only speaking, but you're not listening, then you're just engaging in rhetoric, and that's not deliberative. So it has to be two-way, right? And so another way to think about that is that to participate in the public sphere in its normative sense, you have to reason. As a participant, you have to be able to reason conscientiously, right, in the way that I've defined it. And as I mentioned, in our cognitive architecture, we have the capacity to do that. Like, even if you're the most cynical person, right, and think that everybody's just a motivated reasoner, like every single human has the capacity to use conscientious reasoning, where they seek out diverse perspectives and try to solve complex problems. Every human can do that, but LLMs, by their design, cannot do that. They're not able to listen. They're only able to speak, because the LLMs can only provide responses based on what's in their training data. And so you could think of right, what's in the user's mind currently is not in the LLM's belief system. It's just not, and there's no way to put it in there. There's methods you can use to try to change LLM's beliefs, right? So I don't know if Leilani's here. Are you here? Anyway, there's computer scientists who have come up with methods, right, to do belief steering for models, but that's not the same as the LLM itself listening to you, right, and updating its beliefs the way that humans can. And so deliberation, in this normative sense, requires that whoever the debate participants are, they have to be able to not only speak, but they have to be able to listen. And LLMs cannot listen. There's not, like in their architecture, their design, they can't do it. And so as our colleague Simone Chambers at UC Irvine, and then Plato before her, warned about, is if you only have, but both are like Simone's amazing, so they're both extremely good authorities on this, is that, right, if people are speaking and not listening, they're just engaging in what they would call rhetoric, which is deeply harmful to democracy. Because you could think about it, really all you're getting then is manipulation. And so the implication of the second paradox is this twofold, right? So one is that when you have these platforms that are using the LLM, right, as a debate participant, they're inherently going to undermine deliberation, no matter what their good intentions are, right? Because the LLM is just manipulating, it's just engaging in that non-deliberative rhetoric. But then the bigger risk, right, is that, and we were just talking about this in a previous session, that if we come to rely on LLMs as the thing that supplies discourse to the public sphere, right, then that's going to diminish our own capacity to be able to engage in deliberation. And then I'll tell you, if we can't engage in conscientious reasoning, there is no justification or reason to have democratic institutions or principles, because all we're getting at that point is manipulation, and it's not democracy. Okay, so just to wrap up, thinking about going forward, comparing Paradox 1 to Paradox 2, right, that you have some platforms that are using LLMs to underwrite democracy, right, and make democracy more robust, and then these other ones that are undermining democracy. Which one of those kinds of applications ends up dominating is going to determine, right, whether LLMs are going to be help democracy or destroy it. But that said, this is, I think what you guys would say is that these are all just kind of practical reasons that I'm giving, right? We might as well use closed box for the first kind, and that's a good point. So I do agree, right, that it's better, and we've mentioned this a bunch of times during the day today, that it's better if we had LLM development that was governed by open source principles and processes, right, that we all get to weigh in as a community on, like, the constitution that governs the model's behavior and so on. And this is something that somebody at an earlier panel mentioned. There is a very hopeful development in SB 53 that recently passed here in California, is to create the Cal Compute Initiative. And it's an initiative that's designed to create an open computing environment and to situate it in the UC system, right? And then that environment, it would be designed to host a public option LLM. And the idea is, right, and I think the idea is that if you take all of the brain power of the 10 campus UC system, we're at least as smart as Google, I think. And so the idea is, if we could build out a really good LLM that's designed to serve the public interest, then maybe it would crowd out these untrustworthy models, the same way that people worried about the public option in Obamacare crowding out private insurance. And so the last slide is going to have a link to these talk slides. And so you can, if you are interested, you can, get the slides and then click on that link to Cal Compute. There's also, the slides has links to some of the projects I talked about. But I have to disclose this, and I think this is apparent. You know how, like, when you're writing in Google Slides, they keep telling you, click here to make your slide more beautiful, and I didn't do it. And all right, thank you. I don't know how much time. Do we have time? Okay. Yeah, I'm done. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So but I'm done. My talk, yes. Yeah. By the way, just while if we were using Protanium, I would already know what you guys are thinking.
Thank you for the talk. Fascinating. I am a little concerned about your conclusion to Paradox 1, that because you didn't detect bias in the black box models, that we don't need to worry about the presence of bias. Is there a different way that could be framed that couldn't be used as a hot take to make these models appear safer than they are?
That's a good question. So I think, are you saying that we test for bias in some ways, but then you don't know how, like, it could be biased in any number of ways, right? Okay, yeah, and that I'm being kind of an apologist for the black box models, and yeah, I know you're not saying that, but yeah, I don't know. I think that what people say is that at least with LLMs, you can audit them for bias in a way that, like, if you have a real-time meeting, like this meeting here, right? If you guys were to ask questions that had systemic biases, there isn't really a way to kind of track that or audit it. And so I don't know if that, I don't know, like I think maybe, and obviously this is a whole field of computer science of kind of doing these bias audits. Yeah, so, but I didn't mean to sound like an apologist for the black box models, yeah.
So my question is quite related, but I'm going to phrase it in a more controversial way. I'm interested if you know, if you've looked at sort of where the limits of its ability to summarize are. So I frequently get told by AIs, I'm not going to talk to you about that. If you talk to a Chinese AI and you want to talk about Taiwan independence, no. If you talk to a California AI about we should have white supremacy, no. If you talk to a US AI about like the right way to solve a geopolitical problem is to like remove the head of state of another country, like no, until you point out the US did it, then okay, it's okay. But right, so like there's things they won't talk about, but will they summarize? Because you're talking, so I'm wondering if you know something about the limits.
So I'm a political scientist, not a computer scientist, so I don't do research on that. But I do think it's interesting that even the private development, fully black box models come with guardrails, right? And that there's some sort of internal deliberation inside of those companies that's getting them to be better than they would be if they were just profit driven. And so I think the things you're saying is the reason that Gemini or Claude won't respond is because you've asked it something that it's been told not to answer. And so that's a bit of safety that's built in.
Those are all mainstream viewpoints, right? Like lots of people believe part of China. Lots of people believe
yeah. Well, it depends on which model. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I'd have to know more about the open. So the nice thing about open source models is you know what the data is, and there's other models like Mistral. Apparently, you know what it used for its training data. So maybe the answer would be, if you worried about it, would be to swap in a different and better model, right, where you had more transparency, right, and not just because UCR pays for Gemini, but if I had maybe deeper principles, I'd at least use Mistral or something. I don't know if that helps. Yeah. I mean, just what the reason. So LLMs respond because of what's they've been trained on. The alignment processes, and then the guardrails, right? And those are things, right? In an open model, you know what those are. In a closed model, you have no idea what those are. And so that's kind of the risk. I think you're right. I think it's a good point. Excellent point. Criticism, yeah.
Yeah, this question really doesn't bear directly on your theses here, but what role does anonymity play in the deliberative processes?
Yeah.
Where it's maybe a common everyday anonymity, sort of like I share anonymity with some people with most people, but not everybody in this room, or with regard to particular things like a la Turing test, human, non-human, or gender as a smaller example, but anonymity in general.
Do you mean anonymity of the human participants, or anonymity where you don't know if you're talking to an LLM?
Both.
Yeah, well, so with humans, there's, that's a hotly discussed topic, right? Anonymity and deliberation in my field, right? Because on the one hand, if you have anonymity, you're freer to speak. But on the other hand, for example, we used Protanium in high school as part of a curricular module for high school seniors to have online town halls with their member of Congress. And the very first, and because these were students and it was student data, we felt it was really important that the students were anonymous. And so they used screen names instead of their real names. And the very first session, as soon as we opened Protanium up, a bunch of boys started saying derogatory things about girls in the room. And it was just like, what are you doing? And that's the problem with anonymity, right? Is that people don't have any accountability, right? So it's just a trade-off, and there's not like one best answer, but I think, I don't have an answer about I think that we've had a number of sessions today where people have talked about how do you know, right, if you're working with LLM output as opposed to human output, and which one is more authentic. The thing I'll say is the Habermas machine, and kind of what got their paper published in Science, is they did their experiment with the LLMs doing these consensus statements, and then they had a different version where they had humans creating consensus statements, and people liked the LLM consensus statements better from Chinchilla. So I don't know. Yeah.
Hello. So you pointed out that in one case, the public body has used Claude. In another instance, they've used Gemini. So do you know, how do governments use these models? And the second part is, we all know the environmental impact of these models.
Right.
Is there any push towards pushing for transparency around how much of resources these models are using while government bodies select these models?
Yeah, I don't know. So the Polis is used by a number of governments at all different levels, and so the big example of that is this V Taiwan initiative that they kind of rolled it out nationwide, and so I don't know. I mean, I haven't. I don't know how. It's a good point that. Right, that it would be problematic for governments, right, to be using this technology that has these impacts. But I don't know if they've had that debate or not. Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
For